So this is a collab between me and the YouTuber known as Matri Archetype. We had a really nice 2-hour conversation a couple weeks back, and what you're going to see now is part of that conversation. It comes from obviously like a longer video, and the links to the longer video, which is about an hour long, will be in the description and the pinned comment. And there should be a second video up now about both our experience of growing up in the UK and how we like brainwashed into neoliberalism and stuff like that. And that should be out by the time this video is live. Go give Matriarchetype a sub, go check out her content. I really enjoy it. And yeah, I've done a fair few collabs, but I think this was my most enjoyable one. And we just had a really good conversation. So I hope you enjoy what you're going to see on this channel right now. And if you want more of this conversation, like I said, it was about 2 hours long, head over to Matriarchetype's channel and check out the rest of the video.
I mean, it's the most unique perspective probably you have on YouTube. Not to just like bore you down to trans women in Japan, but I mean, like, I don't think there's another YouTuber who is English, transgender, speaks Japanese, lives in Japan. So I think it's like a good place to, you know, to talk about this as well.
Got my niche, and that's definitely something we can talk about. The kind of the tourist elements and the glorification of Japan are there for a reason. It's a great place, and obviously we're happy to live here, and I have so much good to say about it, but there is this kind of sinister undertone of xenophobia, and yeah, it's very safe, it's very pleasing, but there's a large change coming, I think, to the country. And so I experienced Japan like 10 years ago, and coming back here, dabbling in working out here as well, and seeing my husband work and properly, you know, get a job and career here, I can kind of make that kind of comparison of 10 years, which is, I would say, even different to someone that's lived here for the full 10 years, because sometimes when you stay somewhere, you're not aware of the changes to that extent. But it definitely feels now that Japan knows it has to rely on foreign labour much more than it did want to admit 10 years ago. And so we've heard about the shrinking population of Japan for so long, but now we're actually seeing it, and we're seeing a kind of complete lack of trust in the pension system in the future. We have the kind of Japanese version of Gen Z is an entire generation that want to be YouTubers, and they don't want to get a job like their parents did and work silly hours and never see their kids, you know, and true to an extent in many countries. But Japan is finally now seeing the effects of this. So it's quite interesting to see the juxtaposition, and there's a lot of talk of kind of business consultation companies are really, you see them a lot more now, that are trying to help companies hire foreign labour, implement diversity in companies and stuff like that, which is a really interesting shift. And I think that the thing I take from it mostly is that Japan just is kind of doesn't want to admit that it's going to need to rely on a lot of foreigners, as they would call them, but it kind of also knows it has to. So it's in that kind of denial phase right now, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, and didn't they recently reject something in Parliament about making it easier for foreign labourers to come over as well?
Yes, yeah, exactly so. Which again, you can see the kind of two sides of the coin. There's obviously a very conservative roots in Parliament. The Liberal Democrat Party, which is a very conservative party, have been in power the majority for decades. But then there is just this push of like, it has to happen eventually, and that's going to be the opinion of many people in the future, I imagine.
Yeah, the thing is, what's interesting sometimes with these like debates is they can't have their cake and eat it too. Like, if you want to maintain Japan's place as this like leading economy, you can't just not allow migrant labor in, because otherwise you've got to admit that there's going to be less people being able to work. So you have to scale back loads of stuff. But then, like you were saying, like, you know, I think what's not talked about in Japan with the racism is, even though like you've experienced like, kind of like this like non-Japanese, let's call it like non-Japanese xenophobia. I don't think they really cared about you were white. It was more like you weren't Japanese. But they also feel that way about like Korean laborers, Chinese laborers, Indian laborers. And it's pretty amazing. Like, we went to an Indian restaurant, and seeing like an Indian migrant speak like Indian to one family, or like one of the Indian languages, not sure which one it was, English to us, and then Japanese to someone else. So this is obviously, everyone knows if people from migrant backgrounds that don't speak English often are great with languages, like not you know, just English. But that was an interesting thing to see. But I you know, most people love like studio like Ghibli films and stuff, and I made a video about this a while ago. It's like the difference between Miyazaki and Hideo Kojima, who made the Metal Gear games, because they're two different. One guy is in his late 50s, one guy's in his mid 80s, and it's kind of interesting to see that Japanese mentality, because Miyazaki super hates Western stuff, and like because he grew up during the war and afterwards, so he saw his country literally go from like Japanese to occupied by a foreign country, have their whole political system designed by a foreign country, and then have the foreign culture really influence it. But then someone like Kojima, he loves American stuff, because he grew up in a country where everyone loved American stuff. And it's really interesting because you have like two people who are like, you know, proud to be Japanese, but like one's way more open about like, oh, I love everything, like all this different culture. And one's like, no, Japanese, like traditionalist. It reminds me of Tolkien and Lord of the Rings a bit, actually, like how he saw the Norman conquest as like one of the most tragic things that ever happened to England and stuff, because he loved Anglo-Saxon history. That's what Miyazaki reminds me of. And it's interesting today because in Japan, like you were saying, like you have these Gen Z people who in theory you'd think would be more open. I'm not sure what the reality is. And it's probably like the contrast is there with, you have like the 50-year-old politicians who are like, oh, like we must preserve like Japanese culture, whatever that it means to them. But then you might have younger people who grow up with like, so not even just loving Western stuff, but loving, you know, Korean stuff as well. Like what was interesting when I got the flight to Korea was people from Korea who were just bringing back shopping from Japan. Like they literally had no bags apart from shopping bags. So that it's clear they just went to Japan for a weekend, bought shopping, and they're coming back. So then you have like, I guess the younger people would be more open to like this cultural crossover. So it's an interesting place it finds itself in, but then it's completely dominated by one party. Like you're saying, it's conservative, but not in the traditional sense of, I don't think it really fits in the mold of maybe like a Western conservative party, but like you're saying, culturally, it's very like xenophobic conservative. And it's just, I guess it's depressing for Japanese people because like there's no real alternative. And Japanese communism is strong enough in terms of electorally, it does better than most communist parties. But then a lot of people like to remind me that the Japanese Communist Party, they're not as communist as other parties or whatever. But then I think it's cool they have that element. But then it's still like they're super minor parties still. And it's like for Japanese, yeah, it's like what is really the option? It's even worse in the UK. Like what do you even choose apart from, you know, the liberals and stuff?
Absolutely. I think that especially in the UK and the US, there's this tennis match. And even if it's a show and even if it's a facade, there's this tennis match between like conservative and Tory, Republican and Democratic. But Japan is, the LDP, the Liberal Democrats are always going to have, if not, they're just going to form a coalition like they have done with Komeito, the kind of a bit more centre-right party with religious roots. They're just going to form a coalition with who they need to maintain that majority. But that's always left like a sense that there's no point really getting into politics. And I think that I would imagine that's mirrored down into Gen Z, but my millennial generation that I know about more is that like politics is nowhere near as popular to just even talk about in Japan, because what's the point? It's not like there, like you say, there's no variation. But the one thing I would say, the communist parties, and there are a few communist parties now, like all quite weak in power, but you have Kyosan, a kind of like the main one, the JCP, I think they're called, and they have like historical roots and they have this history, which I think is also kind of rare to see, because any history in the West of communism is obviously like kind of Red Scare, like stamped out vibe.
Well, I think they have a bit of legitimacy for being the only Japanese people to resist the fascist government.
Oh yeah, violently as well.
Yeah, and then but also sadly that the CIA literally created the Liberal Party to crush communism in Japan. So, but they, like you're saying, there is that tradition where in the UK the Labour Party pretty much undermined any like Marxism, because it was like, we are socialism, so you don't need Marxism. But then various Labour governments, you know, 30s, 60s, 90s, did some good things. Let's, you know, in the 40s maybe, but like, you know, very much not enough, I'd say. But yeah, like, no, it definitely is interesting. Japan has that history, despite having like very xenophobic or culturally conservative elements and stuff.
Kind of even above politics is that it is a really good country for taking care of its own people. and you can take that in such a good and bad way. But at the end of the day, like this, the Communist Party is also in charge of a lot of social welfare and like the teachers' unions and stuff. It kind of controls them, and that's in a good sense from our opinion, if that makes sense. So, in a sense that like, I find Japan in general for me comes across very neoliberal. It's very much like, if you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps and to some extent add to society, then you will just coast through and try not to want too much, try not to do too little, and you'll be fine. Like that's, unfortunately, it's that very kind of neoliberal version of what we would compare in the West. And then people that are untouchable at the top are just untouchable. You'll never get there. Don't try to be. But equally, you know, there'll be more support for people less fortunate and etc. So in that sense, it's like a very
classist kind of in a different way.
In a different way, yes. In a different way, compared to the classism in the UK, where it's very clear cut. I mean, I actually get Japanese people ask me like, "What's it like to have an upper class? What's it like to be working class?" And it feels like it. I know this is weird to say. It feels like Japanese people are every class and they want to be every class, if that makes sense. Like there's a pride in being the working class that we wouldn't see in the West. Absolute pride in it. And like, but then equally everyone wants to be rich enough to afford nice watches and Chanel things and go shopping in Shinjuku, you know?
Yeah, I have a question about that, because a lot of people talk about Japan being collectivist, and like even kind of what you've just been saying in terms of they'll look after themselves, or like the society if it's perceived as Japanese and stuff. But then you talk about like the neoliberalism. So in my head, it kind of sounds like the theoretical thing of what capitalism is supposed to be in terms of you have to serve a greater purpose, like no laziness or welfare queens in this country. But if you perform your role in capitalism, then in theory you should be good. It's kind of like it sounds like in theory what you're sold with capitalism. Not obviously Japan, you know, has homeless problems, has loads of issues as well. But I'm saying like because of like the collectivism, it's kind of like if you pull your weight in society, then society will value you. Where in the UK it's kind of like pull your weight or fuck you, basically. Like it's like make money or go fuck yourself.
Well, and also in the UK it feels like there's this kind of falsified narrative of like if someone's on benefits they're sponging off society, whereas I think with Japan after the bubble like burst, there was a kind of there's so many people affected that it kind of as a nation had to understand like, okay, this was really serious. We have businessmen with, you know, living in rows under bridges, homeless, and they leave their shoes outside the box in a little like front door Genkan area. Like it was a huge situation, so it had to kind of be faced. And like I say, Japan is better at caring for its own, but you're right in that the other side of that is also very much still the same. Like if you can work, you must work, and if you can't work, you have to justify being lesser, and you are just kind of kicked to the curb. And I would imagine it's probably just better at hiding it than solving the problem. I came here 10 years ago and I worked as a translator in a company, and that was like an entry-level job. My husband now, having a career as an English teacher, is on the same salary a decade later. And rent is obviously not the same. Inflation is starting to creep up after decades of it not moving. I think like it feels like capitalism has finally caught up with Japan, and it's going to have coasted through for a long time, and then suddenly people are going to really start to see the effects.
And didn't like a 30-year-old, I think it's a politician, he said, because there was a film coming out called something 75 about euthanizing old people in Japan, and I think a politician had recently said that they should euthanize people over 80 or something to save the economy money. I think it was a politician or someone famous in Japan who said this. And it's just like what you were kind of saying, like your worth to society, even though there's this collectivist element about caring for each other, maybe when you're in work, it's still seen, well, if you're old, your value is over. Like you cannot contribute to society anymore, which is kind of like neoliberalism anyway. Like your worth is tied to how hard you work. But I guess in the West, you're sold this dream of work hard for 50 years, get a nice pension from the government and get your reward or whatever, some shit like that. But like, it feels like with, you know, maybe attitudes in Japan, not that I know for sure, but in terms of you know, because of this collectivism, it's like you got to pull your weight. And I think I was reading a lot, and you probably know about this. Like even Shinzo Abe's government trying to bring in people or like policies to make people take their holidays at work, because holidays in Japan are relatively good, but no one takes them because of the pressure of, well, if you take a holiday, you're lazy and you're letting everyone else down. And like I found that interesting as well, because it's like, why like this country, you know, has better workers' rights than other countries, but it's like people don't take advantage of it because of the pressure of, no, your whole worth is how hard you work, even though you don't have to legally, basically.
Oh, I mean, it is. And fundamentally, yes, that's something that is, it's almost so prominent that I kind of forget to bring it up, if that makes sense. And I think that a whole part of my kind of journey from that kind of neoliberal girl boss that I was kind of brought up to be, to finding socialism, was starting my career technically in Japan really affected my opinion of work ethic and my productivity. And I mean, I have some horror stories of the first few companies I worked at. I actually asked to take a day off to fly home to the UK for Christmas. And I had to like walk up. It was like a massive open plan office. And I walked up to the woman from HR, who was kind of like the boss's wife. And I like kneeled down behind her and was like, excuse me, please may I take 1 day holiday of my 2 weeks I'm allowed for the year so I can get a cheaper flight home. And she didn't even turn to me. She turned to the entire office and in this bellowing yet feminine voice just said, how long have you been in this company? Under a year. And you have the audacity to ask for a single day off.
Oh, no.
And then she like pointed to the head of finance, was like, head of finance, have you ever taken a day off? No. Head of sales, when was the last time you took a day off? 6 years ago. And you think you should have a day off? Please tell me again why. And like this like 20-year-old nothing of a person, the wisp of a human, just cried, ran to the toilets, and my colleagues came up. I had been in the company for like 3 months. And so that obviously set me up to this understanding of like my worth is in my productivity. And so you're completely right. I mean, it can look after its own. It can have a good social welfare system, but at the end of the day, it's an extremely high octane capitalist machine. And yes, there are successes, but it is also how I would have an opinion of it as a socialist, as a communist, is that it's gonna either need fuel to the fire or it's gonna burn out. I have a few now connections in the YouTube kind of scene, and I was speaking to a Japanese guy who has a very successful channel, and he said this entire generation want to be YouTubers and streamers and VTubers because they don't want to buy into the work system. They know there's not going to be a pension system for them when they retire, so they are kind of grasping at some form of security. But obviously not everyone can be a YouTuber. That's not going to be sustainable. But you know, I don't know. I don't know enough to like forecast, but I can kind of tell what's happening on the ground, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And it's just interesting, and everything you're saying, it's like you say it to someone and they're like, oh, that's good. But then like, so we're talking about that Hassan video and I responded to it and he was saying that like, oh, in Japan, it's really hard to get fired. In Japan, you can have a job for life. And then you see in like Nintendo, the person who made Zelda and Mario in 1982, he still works there and he makes Mario today. And it's like, yeah, that is good. In like theory, it's a good thing to be like, oh, you have the job security. But then it's like, there's also the expectation you're meant to be loyal to this company as well. So it's like, that's not a good thing because you don't shop around for the best job to like that pays you, which capitalists would say you should do. It's like, no, I will be loyal to this company for 40 years just because I'm expected to. Like, I don't think that personally sounds any better than like companies treating you bad, to be honest.
What's actually happening in reality compared to the best cases that are put forward? I mean, looking at those examples, the creator of Nintendo games is obviously going to be, you know, coveted position and good at their job and etc. But I had 3 jobs in Japan in the first year I worked there, and I was fired in the second one for something completely outside of my control. But my boss of the branch was fired and we all had to lose our jobs. So the myth that you have a job for life is a very old fashioned, I think like 20, 30 years ago, maybe. But you also didn't have unions. That's not a thing. No one, like you say, took holiday. So your second family was the office. You leave your actual wife and kids and you go to your family. But these days, again, none of that. It's the same thing that we're seeing in the UK. All of the kind of benefits of capitalism for the labour workforce have been eaten away. Salaries haven't increased in decades. Inflation is slowly creeping up. No one, everyone's overworked. Everyone's working weekends. COVID hit and everything in the same way. And so I wouldn't say you have the same job security. I'd say the opposite. I'd say it's turning to the gig economy again, that we're seeing in the West.
Well, also like you were saying about the hustle culture, YouTubers, like if there's no promise of security. And also I was reading about unions in Japan, and it's kind of followed the trend of America, where it went from like crazy strong unions maybe like 50 years ago, like maybe 70% of the workforce. And now I think in Japan and America, it's like, I think America's like 11% and Japan's like 15%. Like even the UK's followed the same trend where it went from 80 to like 20. Because obviously, thank you, neoliberalism, Margaret Thatcher, and just destroying the welfare state, that, and shipping out all the jobs to foreign countries, that like we don't have that, capability or workforce anymore. And it feels like, like Japan. I made a couple of videos because a lot of the cyberpunk genre was created in the kind of wake of the Japanese economic boom in the 80s. So it's kind of like that xenophobia baked in of, oh, Japan is taking over the world. And why did Japan did, there was this propaganda post I put in my video sometimes. It's Pearl Harbor, one cartoon. It's like 1941 Pearl Harbor, and it's like 1981. It's like economic Pearl Harbor by Japan, flooding the US economy with all these great consumer goods. But then it just feels like Japan with the 80s, it's like it didn't really escape neoliberalism, but it just has its own like twist on it, I guess, because I find different Asian systems like of government very interesting because of, I guess it's religion in some ways, although Japan's interesting because you have Shintoism, Buddhism, but then I read a lot of people are both as well because it's not incompatible. So and then Thailand is like 99% Buddhist, but then Vietnam is like a hit or miss really because of the communist system. But it's just interesting how they all have a different kind of approaches to capitalism. And that's something I thought about when I was there, because like Japan on the surface works like better, but then like we were saying, it reflects England a lot. So I recognize these Japanese like 50-year-old men on the train because that's my dad. Do you know what I mean? Like I see the office workers, like that's my dad. That's my dad in Japan. Like I look at these people and like you remind me of English people so much. Like I guess it's Tokyo and London as these economic centers and stuff. It's all very similar. But then, like you were saying, there's good sides and bad sides to the Japanese version of capitalism. But then it is kind of, it's brutal in a way that you can't get away with, I guess, in other countries. Let's say England versus Japan, because I've heard horror stories about America as well, because there's like no protections in a lot of states. But it is an interesting thing to talk about, because like just to end on this like little section, like we have such this, and it's very easy to get seduced by Japan when you go over as a tourist, and I think even more so for Americans, because America just does not have a society that functions. It's literally a society that's designed for capitalism. Like even people being amazed by the public transport, like Japanese public transport is good, but if you've grown up in like a modern European city, it's quite similar. It's just nicer. But then I guess if you come from LA, where it's 5 lanes, like motorways everywhere, you probably think it's the best thing you've ever seen. It's just interesting because I feel like if you go in to Japan with a bit more of an understanding of this is great for tourism, it like everything that people like serve society like is amazing for tourism. But then if you lived in a country where you couldn't as easy go to an actual supermarket because everywhere's a family mart or like a 7-Eleven, and you got to eat that food, or like you have no time to cook, or you live in an apartment that's so small you literally just have a rice cooker, then you might start thinking, oh my god, like maybe this isn't the perfect society. Even though when I'm running around Tokyo for 2 weeks with no time to sit down, it's great. But if I'm sitting in an tiny apartment all day, it's probably not the best thing ever.
Absolutely. I think it's very hyper consumptionist, is that a word? Consumerist, but like it's like you say, it's designed to have you be able to buy what you want when you want, and then life becomes about that. Everyone is very like singular on their own, eating on their own. That's become a whole genre of YouTube video now. And like you say, there's a convenience store on every road, and that with no hyperbole. Even we live in
It's like
two. I mean, there's 7-Eleven is our combini of choice because we have one. How sad is that? And there are 3 within a 5-minute walk. 3 of the same shop. It's insane. And it's fast food. It's highly processed. It's not great for you, but also because there's actually a food shortage happening. So all of those really nicely stocked shelves that I'm sure Hassan saw, you now see like a single onigiri on like a shelf because they're running out of food. And so, yeah, the cracks are kind of starting to show.